somebody will make the statement, I'm not an artist because I can't draw, which I think is absurd. Being able to draw is a technical skill. I'm talking about the basic fundamental idea of what an artistic idea is and what a scientific idea is, and how they're expressed in art in this case. So the image on the upper left, painted by Alyssa Monks, is a painting. It's done in oils, and it looks exactly like a photograph. And my argument is that this is a science experiment. Because if you gave this image to 100 sufficiently skilled artists, the results of their experiments would be identical. Which is what you want. When you're trying to uncover something about objective reality, that's how you know that your result has been verified. Whereas the image on the right by Gerhard Richter, if you were to give 100 artists a few tubes of paint and to say, I want you to paint something that has some smearing in it, some kind of textural elements in it, you would get 100 paintings that are completely different from one another. The artistic aspect of this spectrum is related in what am I bringing from my subjective experience and turning into objective experience for others to be able to experience. So these define the poles of this spectrum that I'm talking about. And then when you look at this painting in the bottom left by Craig Mullins, what this represents is a person who understands the rules of objective reality and is able to bring their own subjective experience into it. This is a combination of science art. And I think that much of the best work that's being produced is a combination of things. I'll get into kind of the strength of the hybrid vigor. And as an artist who studies the brain, I'm primarily concerned with how can we explain consciousness through art? And how does the average person think about their own brain? The most complex object in the entire universe. The thing that is in each one of your heads at this very instant and is exploding with an insane amount of activity and will continue to do so no matter how stupid a TV show you're watching until you're dead. And what the sad truth of this matter is that this is the type of image that oftentimes comes to people's mind, what you would see in Scientific American or the New York Times. And to be fair, these are illustrations. These are designed to simplify something complicated and to have something that a person can refer to when thinking about something. For example, that the brain is exploding with lightning is a common meme. And what this is meant to illustrate is that even though, for example, my wife is part of the experimental dance scene in Philadelphia, one thing I'm always amazed to find is that even in a genre that defines itself by breaking boundaries and doing something different than everybody else is doing, sure enough, boundaries arise organically. People intuitively follow them, and it becomes constrained by its own kind of groupthink. And this is exactly what happens in illustration all the time. I mean, look at this. Like, how many more images exactly like this do we need to see? I mean, it's teaching you that there's a neuron and that there are darts of light that are moving along its dendrites and axon, and that's useful. But what it's also telling you is that the designer either didn't care or didn't do their homework. The brain is a computer, 1100011111. And it's too bad, because the brain is the ultimate frontier. There is so much aesthetic and conceptual information that can be displayed and communicated about the brain that I feel personally kind of motivated to be able to bring some of that to folks. So you might see images like this, functional MRI images, where you can say, all right, this blob in my brain lights up when I'm picking my nose or something. And that teaches you that the brain is functionally compartmentalized, which is helpful. You might see images like this, photomicrographs, which are telling you, okay, the structure of the brain actually is quite complex. I'm getting that from this. But these tend to be of very constrained areas, and they don't say anything about how the brain is behaving in time. And then, of course, we're all familiar with this type of image, which is the brain as meat. And this, again, there is such a universe inside of this relatively simple-looking structure that I felt, again, very motivated to be able to uncover. And to really just totally transform the way in which we think about the brain, and to invent techniques to be able to display it optimally. And so this is what I did with my collaborator, Dr. Brian Edwards, who's an applied physicist at the University of Pennsylvania. We recently created a piece called Self-Reflected, which is hanging at the Franklin Institute in Philadelphia. And this is what it looks like. So what you're looking at is an 8-foot by 12-foot installation. This is not a digital rendering. This is a physical object on the wall, like you're seeing now, with light strafing over the surface. This is the collective activity of 500,000 neurons, choreographed as close to what we can conceive as happening in your brain at this very moment that you're looking at this image. And that is why this piece is called Self-Reflected. To give you a sense of how much detail there is in the piece, I'll show you some more close-ups here. This is of the brainstem, where basic functions for life are kind of carried out. This is the parietal cortex, where you're integrating motion and your vision. So this might be you petting your cat. This is you playing soccer. This is the cerebellum, where movement and proprioception are happening. You run your finger over your skin. This is the kind of stimulus that you would expect to see. You're smelling the BO of the person next to you. So what is a micro-etching? Fundamentally, a micro-etching is a zillion tiny little etches in the surface of metal. And in the case of our micro-etchings, we use gold. This technique was invented to be able to display very complex subject material by imparting a third dimension of reflectivity into the surface. So what you see in the images on the right is a very close-up image using a macro lens of the surface of a micro-etching. There would be colored lights above it. And what you can see is that there are structures that are right next to each other, which are reflecting totally different colors because they're separated in reflective space based upon the angle of that hatching, which is picking up the light. So you can become very precise in how light is reflecting off of this surface, and you can encode animations. You turn color into an infinite variable, because although the etchings are hard-coded into the surface, the light which is reflecting off of them can be changed indefinitely. And this is what the surface looks like under a scanning electron micrograph. On the right, that's a 1200x image. So there are these little cylindrical reflectors. The National Science Foundation, as Bebe mentioned, became aware of this work a few years ago, and they awarded us a grant to do this installation. And the first question was, what are we going to depict? There's so much to start with. We eventually decided on a sagittal section, which is a slice like this through your brain. We tilted it a little bit to capture some particularly interesting circuitry. And this is what basically a cartoon of that slice looks like, where each colored region is a gray matter region. Gray matter is where the cell bodies in your brain reside. And each one of these different colored regions are functionally distinct from one another. So we did a whole bunch of research figuring out what types of neurons are where, what they're connected to, what their firing patterns look like, that sort of thing, and assembled a whole bunch of that in order to produce this type of painting. So all of the neurons were painted by this technique that I've developed, in which ink is blown around on non-absorbent paper. And the reason that I worked out this technique is because I realized that your brain sucks at generating randomness. And the branching patterns of neurons are very spontaneous and chaotic. And when you're there trying to engineer the painting of this shape, what you find is that you adhere to all sorts of unconscious rules, because your brain is a pattern detector and a pattern generator. Randomness has no use in our life, really. So why not observe nature, see that nature wants to form these shapes. You see them all over the place. So why not utilize a natural process and allow that to unfold on the canvas? And in the case of this, the kind of ink spattering aspect of it can be used as more of an abstract expressionist method, which also very clearly captures the spirit of neurons. So 150 different types of neurons were painted, and many examples of each, and scanned into the computer. And the right image is of them being vectorized, so they're turned into math, which is the kind of realm we're in after this point. Once we had these libraries of neurons, we were able to assemble all of the gray matter regions, paint them using programs in vector. And here, this is just a small region of the cerebral cortex, which is the covering of your brain, the kind of wrinkly structure. And there's maybe a couple thousand neurons here. and all of the gray matter was painted via this method. But the gray matter is only half of the story, because the other half of your brain by weight is the white matter, which are the connections between the neurons. If you look at a slice in the brain, you'll notice it's a little bit paler. They're the highways which information travels up and down. So we based a lot of this on some brain scans that were given to us by some colleagues at Carnegie Mellon University, but ended up painting it all by scratch in the end to interface with the algorithm. At this point, we already have pretty much the most complicated illustration of the brain, and it's just in 2 dimensions. There's maybe 1 million or slightly less neurons in it. But what we did next really transformed things and brought it to the next level, which is how do we put causative relationships into these neural circuits? How can we actually emulate and simulate how the brain is functioning? So the basic unit of how we did this is that we started with these gray matter regions, the cell bodies. We told the algorithm, we want you to start with these cells, we want you to connect up to these axons, and we want you to synapse on the final cell bodies. This is one step in a neural choreography, we call them. And we have about 600 of these steps of neural choreography, each of which is controlled by about 30 variables, which are doing things like how fast is the action potential moving, how much chaos is there in the connections, are the neurons firing as a burst or are they firing one by one? So tons of control, and as Brian would say, plenty of rope to hang yourself with if you are giving yourself too many options. But this is the output of what the algorithm makes. So it's sequencing things in time. It knows that neuron 1 is starting at time equals 0, and that there's a time associated with its action potential moving along its axon to the next spot. So what you're looking at here is a map of time. Anything that you see in a red pixel would be visible all the way to the left of the etching. And then as you walk in this direction, you would see the orange, the yellow, the green, the blue, and the violet all the way to the right. So if we zoom in on a small region of it, this is actually the motor cortex, which is this piece right here. If you zoom in on a small region of it, this is the actual data that's coming out of a different set of algorithms that we designed for this. And what this algorithm is doing is it's saying, where is this pixel in XY space on the canvas? Where's the light source it's being illuminated with? Where, based upon its color, is it going to be reflecting that light? And based upon that, we can calculate the math as to what angle we need to make an etch at that spot in order to send the photons exactly where we want them to go. So the algorithm calculates this for the entire piece and then uses vector calculus to align all of these etches into this type of image. So this is about 30 gigs worth of binary data that was printed onto transparencies at ultra high resolution that we use to do the photolithography, which is a technique wherein light is used to carve into surfaces in 3 dimensions. It's similar to how computer microchips are made. So using this technique, we created the micro-etched surface that we then figured out some ways to apply gold leaf to the surface to increase the reflectivity, because these images or the pieces of art are completely based upon reflected light. So we hand apply gold leaf to the surface. In the case of self-reflectors, there's about 2,000 sheets of it, and 25 individual panels that were assembled and cut down into this compilation. This is 9 of them tiled up against one another. That's Brian in the picture. And this is what the final piece looks like under a single white light. But remember that this piece can appear in an infinite number of ways. So all you need to do is change the color of the lights and you get a totally different looking image. And in fact, at the Franklin Institute, there's a series of lights which are kind of going on and off of this. This is of the thalamus, which is this piece right here. This is kind of like the master control of the brain. It's right at the very center. It's routing all sorts of perceptual and emotional memory-based information and is important for giving us conscious experience. Here's the cerebellum under a multicolored light. This is the frontal eye fields, which helps you to direct your eyes towards specific stimuli, the parietal cortex, and a zoom in of the gyrus. The gyrus is the outcropping, the wrinkled part of your brain. What this image is telling you and kind of reminding you of is that when you're filling up the etch bandwidth, if you will, with colored light, you can kind of see how the animation will proceed over time. You can see, for example, that all the red neurons are functioning as one unit of processing, and that the information is traveling up and down through the different regions of cortex. This one is called movement and sensation. This is actually a print in the back here. And the left gyrus, movement, and the one to the right is involved in somatosensation, or your touch sensation. And another one of the brainstem and cerebellum. That's what the piece looks like in situ at the Franklin. And one of the questions I was asking myself after 2 years of making this damn thing was, why? And the best reason is, imagine a little kid going into space and standing in front of this gigantic glittering gold surface and having that light strafe over it for the first time and 500,000 neurons just blaze into activity. And for that kid, just for an instant, to look up at it and just say, wow. That emotional connection is everything, everything. Our emotions are what is driving us. We like to think that it's our intellect which is in control, but that is not the case. I mean, from a neuroscientific perspective, the limbic system, the emotions, evolved way, way sooner. And the connections which are actually changing our perceptions based upon our emotions are very strong within us, whether or not we realize it. And the power of art, the unique power of it, is that you can communicate these types of complex subject materials through it. I can scream and yell all day. The brain has 86 billion neurons. And you're like, who gives a shit? I don't even know what that means. It's like a meaningless, dry fact. But if you show somebody what 500,000 of them looks like all at once, then it's like, oh, I'm getting a little bit of what that means. Even though this is hundreds of million times less complicated than it actually is. I mentioned that I'm interested in consciousness. And this was an attempt to kind of gather scientific materials and to bring it into the realm of art, to the realm of my kind of subjective interpretation of it to some degree. And at the same time, I'm interested in studying the brain from the other perspective, which is through my subjective experience and trying to express that as well. And this piece, Pranayama, is hanging right over here. So I've been a meditator for about 15 years, and I have a sensory deprivation tank in my house. And after years of practice, you start to develop it's like a new sense for this material called prana, this energy that's very subtle. You have to be very still to feel it in your body. And little by little, you start to feel it more, and you learn how to control it using your breath. And it's a very abstract concept, and it's particularly difficult to explain to scientists who look at you with very skeptical eyes when you're talking about such a thing. But I encourage you to do the experiment yourself. And what I wanted to do with this piece is to essentially map where the prana moves in my body when I'm doing this exercise. And so the density of the tendrils is correlated with how finely I feel this energy moving in the body. And at the point between the eyebrows in particular is the point at which you feel, it's almost as if the outside and the inside annihilate one another, and you enter into this space where there's just nothing there at all. And the concept here, and what you'll see when you move back and forth between the piece, is that this figure is breathing in meditation. Again, pranayama is the control of prana through breath. So in this image right here, the figure is inhaling. Here comes the exhale. The prana is moving up the central channel and out. Here's the inhale. Here's the inhale and the exhale. And this piece is really meant to be a reminder to bring our mind back to the present. And remember that that's always a good idea, to keep your mind calm, because that's the time in which connections are made. You know, it's also the time when you catch that stupid little voice in the back of your mind that's just irritating you. Just like, all right, I see you're there. You can stop now. So just given the nature of the salon, it seemed appropriate to talk a little bit about this. And this is the left side, which is some of the lessons that I've learned being a professional artist and a professional neuroscientist, and then combining those things together, which are that I can't tell you how many times I've learned that if you start with a crappy foundation that no amount of slick jazz you throw at it is going to make it any better at all. It's just going to waste your time. And that when you have a very clear idea of what you're going for, that everything else just flows from that very easily, including invention of technology that supports that idea. But the trick is that you got to start with the heart and polish with the technology. And this is why I love Pixar so much, is because they understand that people are going to see their movies because the characters are great and the story is great. And then you're wowed by the fact that a monster has 100 million individually rendered hairs after you have enjoyed the story of the movie, not before, which some movie studios seem to forget. It can be painful, but just destroying your work is always a good idea. And being skeptical of the first idea that comes into your mind, because often it's one that's just been digested loosely through some of the other stuff that you've seen and isn't going to really take you very far. So I tend to keep ideas in my head for long periods of time and return to them and ask myself the question, is this actually something that's worth investing my time in, or was I just manic in the moment that I came up with it? As you may have detected in those first sets of images, just allow yourself to go to the dark side and gain power from your irritation with bad design. Because I think that it helps you to motivate me at least to create something a little bit better. I've also learned to not overstep my bounds and to try to produce the best work that I can on a foundation that I'm solid on, while of course iterating my skills at the same time, but not trying to overstep them and produce something that's weak. And then of course what you hear from everybody everywhere, which is that the combination of interests always strengthens work. It always gives you perspective. It always allows you to bring totally fresh ideas into something that otherwise you would just be caught in that same groupthink and unable to do anything interesting. So in conclusion, I'd like to thank, so if you're interested in a little bit more about this, these are some of the publications that the work has been written about and some of the institutions where I have work hanging. And I want to give a huge thanks to SAP and to Essinova for setting up this event. It's freaking awesome. I'm really, truly honored to be here, and I thank you for your attention.